Okay, so we're just going to pick up from where we left off on chapter 8 on employment. So, lack of financial resources is often an issue for anyone who's in an abusive relationship, but especially battered women. Employment can offer some help to them. But women often report that their assaults increase, meaning that there's a risk of employment. So, battering can also cause issues in finding a job, but it can also cause strains within the relationship and cause more battering. So finding and holding a job becomes much more difficult when you're a victim of this kind of abuse, right? As we see in Beth's experiences in I Am Not Your Victim. So when it comes to male to female IPV and barriers to employment, studies have shown that abusers often prevent women from working in ways like turning off their alarm clock, cutting their hair just in the middle of the night to embarrass them, so they won't feel comfortable going to work, refusing to take care of the kids or taking the car so that they can't get transportation. Or for women that go to school, they're often sabotaged, like sabotaging her homework, taking her school books. So not only did some abusers demand that their partners not work at all or disliked their working, they forbid them from going to school or discouraged it. So obviously we know when it comes to having stability and especially being able to leave an abusive partner, having employment, having education, these things are valuable resources for the abused. So taking those things away is a power issue for the abuser that's trying to control the victim. So when it comes to lack of financial support, this is why a lot of victims seek welfare assistance. So obviously there's a high prevalence of battering among women on welfare. The exact percentages are unknown because studies are pretty limited when it comes to this stuff, but victimization rates for women on welfare may be twice as high as those that are not receiving aid. And there are some specific reasons for this, especially because to get certain resources, if you're saying, like, let's say you're getting financial support for your children, then you're going to have to list who the father is, and they're going to have certain contact information for you as well. That puts a victim that's left their abuser at risk. So, there's a lot of well-intentioned changes, especially this welfare to work programs, right, that are based on public sentiments that the poor are just leeches and that people are staying on, welfare just to game the system, right? But we find that actually a lot of money goes unclaimed because a lot of people don't take advantage of these resources. So a comprehensive 3-year study found that women with higher levels of IPV and lower levels of social support reported less employment stability. So clearly these are related factors. So the Family Violence Option, this is a federal government program that helps people that receive TAMF, or what's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It helps women receiving this to deal with the harassment that might happen either at their work or, education facility. And this offers some leeway for them to report who the father is, since some fathers who are forced to pay child support will become violent because of that. They see that as a, kind of usurping their power or control. So, taking into account the specific issues that battered women face when trying to get these resources is important in order to adequately provide resources that people need, but not put a person more at risk. When it comes to criminal justice system responses, advocates have successfully lobbied for legislation that protects women and children from abuse. So there are still inadequacies in the law that need to be addressed, such as giving battered women access to free or affordable legal services is obviously an important one, especially when you're talking about people living in shelters, someone who doesn't have the kind of money to provide the legal services themselves, right? So there's some small steps in this regard, but a lot of women still struggle with getting access to legal help. Another issue too, I should say under legal before I move on, are protective orders. So that's basically an order for an abuser to stay away from the victim, and experts are now calling for mandatory protective orders in a lot of these situations because protective orders can often be life-saving, though a lot of protective orders themselves, are still violated. So when using civil protection orders, women that seek these are typically those who have been emotionally abused versus criminal orders that women, have been physically abused typically utilize. So there are different levels of protective orders. Like I said, criminal or civil. When it comes to serving protective orders, you'd think it would be a relatively speedy process, right? This would be a priority in a violent crime case. But often, they are never served. About 34% of protective orders within Los Angeles County, they show research in the book, were not served at all. And it's very common for people to violate these orders. Over 50% of the time, the abuser reoffends even when the order is in place. So if we took these things more seriously, we could deal with a lot of the issues before they spiral out into more violence or just worse scenarios. So again, if half of the protective orders are violated and enforcement is so lax that many women have to resort to suing the police department because of non-enforcement, right? Instead of taking it seriously when someone's just trying to, have their safety protected. So the most common weapon involved in IPV altercations is guns. So this often leads to death, but often the gun is used as a tool of control to intimidate and terrorize the victim for multiple times before it's actually used as a weapon. So it is interesting that the weapon can be very psychological as well. All right, moving on to arrest policies. So historically, these issues have been treated in the societal way, that abuse is personal family business, not their business. So police departments historically trivialize family violence as non-criminal or primarily consisting of verbal spats, right? Not seeing it as the escalating issues that it is. So when looking at the history of inadequate legislation, the fact that the police didn't respond to a lot of cases led to research on the motivations of police, right? To see why aren't they arresting? Why don't they arrest abusers, right? One observation was the slowness of police responses, or have to do basically with not arresting violent offenders even in situations where they use guns, knives, clubs, or they threw their partner down the stairs. There's still situations where they weren't taken into custody. So that's when you start to have to wonder about what are the, motivations, the pressing issues. How do they see these communities to understand why they're not reacting as if someone just threw a stranger down the stairs, they'd be going to jail. Why then if you throw a partner, an intimate partner down the stairs, right? Well, because we have societal justifications that say that maybe that person said something. Maybe they went over the line. But again, there's no justification for throwing a person downstairs, obviously, right? But even in these extreme cases. So in the mid-90s, policies changed. There was a lot of criticism of the police discretion. So police could just tell an abuser, like, hey, go walk it off, right? And so now, since the mid-90s, these things have changed, and now police have to make an arrest in a lot of situations when there's a probable cause. So there's certain states like California is a mandatory arrest state where someone will be arrested, right, in that altercation. And often women are also charged, right? So they might call the police because they feel that, they're at risk of, death or further harm at the hands of their abuser, and then they are also arrested in a dual arrest. So when it comes to the philosophy of law enforcement, research implies that police interventions are ill-suited to meet the challenges of male partner violence. And this is largely because the criminal justice system philosophy does not accurately reflect the realities of battering, since they're looking at it incident by incident, not by history of abusive incidents. Meaning that if you look at, if police weren't just called out separately to each case separately, then, and they often do get to know these offenders, meaning that they're called to the same house over and over. When taking that into consideration, that should be the way that they are dealing with the case, but they deal with it as a situational case-by-case basis, right? And so in some cases that makes more sense. In cases like this, it just does not. When it comes to law enforcement and victim interactions, the practices of police can either help someone or cause barriers to them getting that help. So there's a lot of reasons a victim may not call the police, right? So the first is just the expectations of the police might not meet the expectations of the victim. So meaning not all victims want their abuser to be arrested. Sometimes women are just trying to show their abuser that they need to be taken seriously. Sometimes they just want this person to get help, like anger management or counseling, therapy, right? So new studies suggest that victims' perception of police may be improving as the police themselves gain more specialized units and have more training themselves in how to deal with these things. When it comes to criminal justice system processing, when we're looking at offenders who are processed, we have to keep in mind that most abuse is not reported. So obviously we're only getting certain cases of these things when someone's already going through the system. So prosecution of male to female IPV perpetrators, there's some complaints that prosecutors think that victims are not serious when they won't testify against their abuser. Since IPV is a crime to the state, prosecutors will press on even if the victim won't testify. And some women are reluctant to testify. Research has found that there's many reasons that women would refuse to testify, but mostly a fear of retaliation, right? They feel that they have no support, and they also feel that they're not going to be believed. So they're often dependent on the abuser for their housing, for other life circumstances. So they feel that if they, say anything bad about this person, they're going to face more retaliation as a result. When it comes to judicial behavior and decision making, when it comes to judges' sentencing practices, research has shown that even the most egregious assaults that men perpetrate, those men rarely get sentenced, about 23% of which are sent to jail. And often judges will allow questioning of victims that's highly sexist or hurtful. So there's an example in the book that a woman was stabbed 47 times, and the male perpetrator got 37 days in jail. Also, there are different types of judges, right? They're basically, the book labels them in 3 different types. The good-natured judge that supports victims, the bureaucratic judge who's formal and condescending, and condescending harsh judges who treat women unfavorably. So there's even some shocking examples they give in the chapter, right, where they basically make a joke of a woman who was immolated, literally lit on fire, right? So part of this issue is a lack of judicial training, right? This is cited as a major issue for why this still continues. When it comes to effects of male to female IPV on battered women's lives, the leave-stay decision-making process is an important one to understand. So first, for women who want to leave, there are barriers, right? Such as, lack of money, obviously, family social role expectations, this idea that a woman has to stay with her husband, right? That she's failed somehow as a wife. Psychological impacts of abuse, like fear that they might be facing. And so research found that when people stay with a partner, they often do so because they promise to change, right? Or they have a lack of money or nowhere really else to go. So there's psychological issues as well, right? So emotional abuse plays a pivotal role in diminishing a victim's ability to leave an abusive relationship, and often the emotional and psychological side really isn't taken into account. So entrapment is basically assuming that a victim can leave if they want to. So it leads to this misunderstanding about battered women where people say, like, she's asking for it because she can leave if she wants to. But if you know the actual understanding of their circumstances, you know that they just don't have that autonomy. So, do battered women stay? Well, women often seek help, and they often try to leave their abusers, which flies in the face of the cultural assumption that women are complicit in the abuse used against them. When it comes to dangers of leaving an abusive partner, there's a lot of worry about experiencing a backlash, right? That, these dangerous assaults are associated with leaving. There's often an increase in violence when a woman attempts to leave. There are also so many emotional conflicts that happen in these situations. So forgiveness is a complicated issue, right? In some sense, it's offensive to some victims to say, oh, well, you should forgive the perpetrator. But at the same time, it makes sense that if you're carrying this anger and this emotional problem with you, that you're basically, the way I've best heard it put together is that you're giving someone rent-free space in your head, right? You're unable to move on and deal with your own life circumstances because you're still focused on, what has happened. So that's a huge problem, is that it's a very emotionally conflicted situation. You might have loved this person or had children with them or, married them, spent a considerable amount of your life with them. And so that just makes it more complicated when it comes to trying to figure out how to leave them. Economic dependence is a big part of this. Obviously, women's economic dependence has a lot of an impact on whether they leave or not. And this has to do with just the way that the abuser understands this, and this is why they control and manipulate their access to money and resources. Also, there's an issue of inadequate support for battered women, right? So we have some temporary situations, but we really don't have long-term solutions to these issues. And so since so many people are facing this, not everyone that needs help gets help. So also responses by faith communities are extremely important. Like we discussed previously, a lot of people reach out to their leaders at their religious, community to talk to, to basically come forward with the abuse, So it's important that the clergy themselves be very effective in counseling people, right? Because if a clergy member, if someone discloses to them and they say something, supportive and helpful to them that has like a large positive impact on that victim's self-esteem, versus if the person tells them that, divorce is a sin, right? Or something like that, or tells them that like you married this person, now you got to stick it out. That's obviously going to cause a lot more emotional turmoil. So some of the recommended changes is just to stop blaming women, right? Include battering into premarital counseling. A lot of religious faith communities have, premarital counseling or kind of programs that people go through to be able to be married within that church. So maybe include some of that and also help congregants understand what IPV looks like and some of its signs so that they don't have to be bystanders and they can help other people in their faith communities. Continuing with effects, obviously the welfare thing is a big problem, right? Guidelines for letting abusers know the locations of their children is not possible for a lot of people. They feel like it's not worth the risk to get the money and the resources if this person then knows where they live. So, some women just won't report IPV as well because they're afraid that CPS will come in and take away their children. Which may or may not happen, right? And so that obviously affects whether or not they're taking the abuse seriously and dealing with the abuse head on, because they're more concerned about, potentially losing custody of their children and having to try to fight to get those children back. So part of this has to do with shelters and transitional supportive housing and leaving, right? Obviously, shelters have saved many lives. They also help victims gain temporary welfare benefits, and they try to help a lot of people with jobs, right? And other sorts of help like that, legal assistance, things like that. And though some women are helped, there are others that are turned away for reasons such as medical conditions or disabilities. There's some women, like if you have a teenage boy over 13, there's some shelter systems that just simply won't admit you, right? Or if you have drug or alcohol issues, there's a lot of shelters that won't take you. And again, we know that these things are related, right? We know that some people, if they have to choose between their kid or, leaving that abuser, they might stay with the abuser to stay with their child. But also, there's a situation where a lot of people self-medicate out with alcohol and drugs. And so instead of letting them in and then getting them the help they need there's this idea that somehow they have to get sober while in a tumultuous, emotional, potentially physically violent situation, right? So the transitional supportive housing is great, but it's just temporary, right? It's just a place where women can stay until they can get on their feet. And there are some other programs that try to mine that gap. But the problem is that just in general, we have a very kind of lax social welfare state that doesn't really provide a lot of resources for people if they're going through, financial issues. Not anything like, in Europe or places like that. So this just means that it becomes much more of a burden for those women to try to get out of those situations. Obviously, it's emotional, right? A lot of us are socialized to have a value of relationship commitment, right? That you're socialized to work it out. That whole stand by your man kind of crap, right? Which is an emotional issue, and that can plague women in whether they leave or stay. There's also what they call the investment model, right? The idea that it's kind of trying to understand the rationalization process that victims go through, arguing the pros and cons of a relationship, any possible alternatives, and the financial situation, right? And that's going to affect whether she leaves. Oh, and of course, the biggest part of that, do they have kids together, right? Is she going to be homeless by herself, or is she taking kids to be homeless with her? That's a big difference. So there's also a part that often isn't discussed about, which is the relationship hope. That can be a powerful influence that, this person really cares and maybe next time they'll change the behaviors. And so that keeps a lot of people there, right? That kind of, we talked about that before too, how people feel like, some victims feel like they have power in acquiescing to whatever the demands of the abuser are so that they can basically control their abuser that way, though that's not really how that works, right? When it comes to male victims of intimate partner violence, so female to male IPV, while the majority of reported victims are women, there's this invisible problem of IPV against men, right? There are many men that are suffering in similar ways to women. They're trapped emotionally in similar ways, and they're often, Well, in fact, they are much less likely to receive help or support than women are. So males that suffer from IPV are often misinterpreted to be the perpetrators, right? Whether it's by law enforcement, the court systems, etc. And so this just means that they're not as likely to leave as well, right? They especially feel compelled to stay if they are the financial provider for the family. Because again, it's that situation of choosing between your children and yourself. So men who experience IPV are less likely to leave if they have young children, and that's going to affect, whether they seek help or not. When looking at specific research in the book, some research has looked at female offenders, but there's almost no information available on male victims. So we do know a little bit about the female perpetrators themselves, but what do we know about specifically the male victims? Not very much. And so this is why so much more research is needed to be able to fill in the gaps so that we can understand and interpret the issue. And also, once we see what's specific about male victims and what they're facing, then we can provide resources for them to bridge those gaps so that they can get out of these violent relationships.